I too want to raise the issue of the National Maternity Hospital, and I do welcome the decision by Cabinet last night to delay by 2 weeks the making of any final decision, at least 2 weeks as I understand it. I welcome the Minister's commitment to appear before the Oireachtas Health Committee as we had asked, and indeed I welcome the ongoing publication of documents on the HSE website. I read the documents that were up last night, I see another this morning. That's important, but the concerns around ownership, control and governance of the new National Maternity Hospital remain, notwithstanding the changes and the publication of those documents. And in particular, the question about ownership, the key question that everyone is asking is, if this is public ownership in all but name, why don't we just move to public ownership? If a 299-year lease amounts effectively to state ownership, why don't we see a gifting of this site to the state so that it is truly and beyond doubt within public ownership, rather than this Byzantine series of legal arrangements. And I've waded through these documents and they're complex, and we've seen legal counsel previously describe these as labyrinthine complex arrangements, making it difficult to establish with certainty the issues of control and governance. And these are legitimate concerns that have been raised, including concerns raised by 2 members of the HSE board, and they're legitimate concerns, we understand, that were raised at Cabinet too by women at the Cabinet table who, as a result of these concerns, were seeing this delay. So these are legitimate questions, and we're asking now, Taoiseach, why we simply can't move to public ownership. Why can't we require the hospital to be gifted to the state, the site on which the hospital is to be built to be gifted to the state, or indeed move to compulsorily purchase it? And we in Labour have been calling for compulsory purchase to be looked at as an option as long ago as 2017, 5 years ago. Had the state moved on that then, we would see the site now in public ownership, and we would not see these ongoing and real concerns around governance and around control. And on governance, really valid concerns again emerging from those documents. Valid and substantive concerns around the control issue when we look at who are going to be the directors, and when we see that effectively the landlord, the SVHG, the St Vincent's Healthcare Group, will have the right to appoint 3 directors onto the new National Maternity Hospital Designated Activity Company, and indeed, under the terms of the document of the constitution of that company, will therefore have the right to appoint a chairperson in 3 years' time on a rotating basis. So that's having the landlord have the right to have a very strong influence in how the tenant runs its affairs. That's a concern, Taoiseach. It's a valid concern arising from the documents. And there's a valid concern also around governance when one looks at that key phrase, clinically appropriate. It's in there. It's in there twice in the constitution of the new company, and it's in there also in the operating licence. And yet it's not present in the clause around the golden share of the minister. Clause 5.3 in the constitution, which says that the minister's golden share is to ensure that the obligations are complied with and that any maternity, gynaecological, obstetric and or neonatal services which are lawfully available in the state shall be available in the new National Maternity Hospital. Let's see that phrase used elsewhere, and those qualifying and conditional words, clinically appropriate, removed from the document. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have these concerns around ownership, around control and around the governance of women's healthcare access.
Taoiseach.
Those words are not clinically appropriate. Were asked or imposed by the HSE. Okay? In the legal documents to make sure that it wouldn't be a cardiac hospital or a neurology hospital or whatever. That's all that means. And it's not nonsense. I just can't shout across the floor, Deputy, nonsense. That is the reality. And the golden share empowers the Minister to enforce the reserved powers within the Constitution and the Articles of Association in terms of all available services. I mean, do you think Dr. Rona O'Mahony, for example, a former master of Holles Street, is making this up? Do you think that Dr. Cliona Murphy, Clinical Director of the HSE's National Women and Infants Health Programme, is making it up when they're articulating with very strong support for this? Or Mary Brosnan, Director of Midwifery and Nursing at the NHS. What I'm trying to say here is up to 52 clinicians who work in Holles Street are saying this should go ahead, that this deal yes? Not lawyers. And not lawyers. Sorry, with the greatest respect. So I think, I think women would trust clinicians maybe more than lawyers in terms of a maternity hospital and delivery. I don't want to get into an argy-bargy across the floor of the House. My point is, what the clinicians are saying to us is, we cannot go on any longer tolerating the substandard physical accommodation in Holles Street, and then all of us say, oh, we all want it to happen, we all want to happen quickly. But not just now, please. Let's go another few years. Let's do a CPO and how long that will take. Well, are you seriously suggesting that 300 years at a tenner a year somehow impedes, undermines the clinical independence, financial independence? It does not. Explain how it does. It doesn't. Because you know, Deputy, as well, and you're a person of far greater legal reputation, expertise than my good self, but you know deep down that 300 years at a tenner a year is essentially public ownership by any other name. And the challenge then is, the real issue that was raised legitimately, in my view, was the state's interest in this, and also guaranteeing that women would have access to all services that are legally permissible. To me, that was a core issue that was raised some time ago in relation to this entire proposal around co-location, which happened many years ago because of the reasons that I've said, because people feel it's the best way to get best outcomes. And therefore, in my view, those issues, in terms of women being entitled to all services, those issues have been comprehensively guaranteed in the constitution of the new hospital, in the operating licence granted by the HSE, which imposes an obligation on the new National Maternity Hospital to provide such services, in the powers given to the Minister in the form of the Golden Share to enforce the reserved powers, in the fact that now Mulvey only allowed for one public interest director, we're now providing for 3 ministerial directors to be appointed in the public interest, along with 3 from the maternity hospital and 3 from St Vincent's. And I think it's a far more advanced agreement now than was the case, listening to what people had said and responding to the concerns that people had legitimately raised. But there's always balance and perspective in the debate, and I think the balance has swung now very strongly in favour of we needing really to provide modern state-of-the-art facilities for the women of the country.
Deputy Bacik.
All of us want to see decent, proper, effective health care for women, in particular for women requiring access to reproductive health care, to maternity care, to gynaecological care. I'm not questioning anyone's bona fides, and I don't think it's helpful to do so. But there are legitimate concerns that remain around ownership, governance and control. Yes, there have been changes made, and positive changes over the years, largely as a result of opposition pressure, and largely as a result of pressure of activists and of women seeking improvements in services, and seeking to ensure we do indeed have a modern, world-class new national maternity hospital. But those concerns still remain, and we know that this state has an unfortunate and terrible legacy of failing women in our access to reproductive health care. It's only 4 years since we repealed the 8th Amendment, and those of us who fought for decades to ensure that women would have a right of access to abortion when we need it, those of us who fought for decades are very conscious that these rights can be very quickly reversed or overturned, as we're seeing in the US with the terrible news about Roe v. Wade and the potential overturning of that landmark decision for women's rights. So I think that legacy, and the legacy of the state in investing a lot of public money, a great deal over the years, in building up infrastructure, private hospitals owned by religious orders, I think we're all very conscious of that legacy, of our schools, of our hospitals that have been funded by the state but remain in the ownership of religious orders or their successor or proxy companies. We're all very conscious of that. We need to do better with the new National Maternity Hospital, with the €1 billion of public money to be put into it. We need to ensure that women do have access, that all of us have access to the health care we need in the 21st century. And that's why we're putting forward these questions. We are doing so in order to be constructive and to improve health care for women in this country.
Women will have that access. That's my point. Women will have that access under these agreements. I don't think you've pointed out as to how the 300-year lease at a tenner a year will undermine those, the interests of women, or indeed the access that women will enjoy under the agreements necessarily to all of these services. That hasn't been explained yet to me, how the 300-year lease agreement somehow undermines the provision of those services, or how it undermines the clinical, operational independence of the new and financial independence of the new National Maternity Hospital. It doesn't. And the constitution of the hospital is very clear. The operating licence provided by the HSE to the new hospital is very clear in terms of obligations to implement and provide all services legally permissible under the law, because we're not comparable to Roe versus Wade, because the Oireachtas has acted here. And the people have acted via referendum. We're not comparable to the judicial situation in the United States at all in this regard. And the Oireachtas has legislated here, and that legislation and the provision of all the services that legislation allows is without question now, legally guaranteed in a series of legal instruments here that have been published. And I think that's beyond question at this stage.
Boyd Barrett.